The fifth installment of the Conjuring Universe takes us all the way back to the very beginning, showing us how the demonic nun known as Valak, seen in The Conjuring 2 and brilliantly teased in Annabelle Creation, came to terrorize the Warrens all those years later. Set in 1952, the nun follows a young nun on the verge of taking her final vows and an experienced priest with a background in the supernatural as they investigate the mysterious and brutal suicide of another nun in an isolated Romanian abbey. They quickly discover that the abbey is infested with an ancient evil known as Valak, who cruelly takes the form of another nun. Along with a local villager, the two must confront demons of their own and trust their faith if they are to overcome this unholy terror. I have to give props to James Wan and his Conjuring Universe for being the first consistently successful cinematic universe post-Marvel. Even as the quality of the other films have varied from film to film, the fact that this franchise has found stable footing and is well on its way to becoming an annual tradition is something to behold. Very few movie franchises achieve this kind of success so quickly, and I eagerly await what may come next. What sets the Conjuring Universe apart from the rest of the pack, is that each film in the series tells a self-contained story with little or no setup for another sequel or spinoff, and the little foreshadowing that's there is usually in the background or woven organically into the plot. I was a late comer to the Conjuring films, passing on the first Conjuring as well as the first Annabelle due to them looking like routine ghost demonic haunted house movies. The good reviews for Annabelle Creation and The Conjuring 2 helped change my opinion, and once I saw both of those, I went back to the originals and gave them a second chance. While Annabelle's cliché story and over-reliance on jump scares brought that movie down, the original Conjuring functions as an old-fashioned faith-based horror film, with an emotional core to help balance out all the darkness and horrific imagery. I had hope, based on the little tidbits and teases that we got from Annabelle Creation and The Conjuring 2, that the nun would continue this golden streak. It definitely had a lot working in its favor, with budding scream queen Taissa Farmiga finally joining her older sister in the series for the first time, as well as some well-crafted teasers and trailers, and just the general concept of a demonic nun being pure nightmare fuel. It had all the ingredients to be another solid spin-off in the vein of Annabelle Creation, and hopefully avoid the pitfalls of the original Annabelle. And so it really pains me to say that The Nun squarely falls in the middle of both of those films. Let me start off by commending the film for its incredible atmosphere and set design. Director Corin Hardy, while no James Wan, manages to replicate many of Wan's signature moves from the other Conjuring films while providing several of his own tricks to keep things fresh and from them getting stale. The film is by far the most visually striking and atmospheric installment of the franchise yet. The film has so many scenes that look like they were lifted from a modernized gothic horror film from the 1930s and 40s. The use of fog, crosses, nun habits, Catholic imagery, and the large castle-esque location all gave the film a really timeless feel and an uneasy ambience that had me questioning every few seconds where the next scare or terror was going to come from. The Abbey setting was an inspired choice, and the filmmakers made excellent use of their locations and sets. There were many scenes inside darkened tunnels in the maze-like structure that kept me on edge for a good portion of the film. I noticed so many small nuances and background details that also helped make the location feel alive and real. The film made good use of several classic church and chapel settings, such as the confessional booth and the altar. If it failed at everything else, The Nun succeeded in building an atmosphere of dread and foreboding, where danger lurked in every dark shadow and corner of the screen. Any scenes featuring Valak front and center were standouts as well, including her first proper introduction in the catacombs below the abbey with Taissa Farmiga. The Nun also succeeds in gathering a very small cast of talented actors that really bring their characters to life, even when handed weak and uneven material. Farmiga in particular brings a grounded and sophisticated yet innocent charm to her character of Sister Irene. She's playful, witty, and incredibly intelligent with a heart of gold to match. Her previous roles in American Horror Story and The Final Girls have cemented her as one of the premier scream queens of my generation, and her work here in The Nun will only further that legacy. She shouldn't be ashamed of it either, because many an actress have made a name for themselves in the horror genre, much like her older sister Vera. Taissa must also be commended for being a real trooper, as her character was subjected to many intense action sequences and some real skin-crawling scenes. I also felt a real maturity on Taissa's part, as this was the first role I saw her in where her character didn't feel like a child or a young adult way in over her head. She remains forthright and devoted to purging the Abbey of evil, even when the odds seem stacked against her. She was the star of the film for me and carried the film almost entirely on her shoulders, and kept the light shining even when the film's figurative and literal darkness began to close in around her. Bichir also impresses here, despite being given very little to do on screen. I was quite impressed with his work in last year's Alien Covenant, and when I heard that he was on board for this project, I was excited to see him in another horror film. Here he plays an experienced pro with a dark background in the occult. Some of the best set pieces are centered around his character, including a nail-biting coffin sequence. He's able to sell that abject terror while still remaining a source of wisdom and strength for the other characters. His backstory is a little routine and not very fleshed out well in comparison to Farmiga's character. Indeed, both actors are given very little material outside of quoting scripture and huddling in fear. I would have liked to have seen a few more interactions between them, of them just talking and getting to know each other before diving into this unholy nightmare. There's some nice banter between the two of them, and it makes up a bulk of the film's light-hearted moments that could have easily been expanded upon to really sell us on their characters. But both actors are up to the Herculean task of elevating this kind of material, and I was actively rooting for both of them to come out on top by the end of the movie, something very few horror films nowadays are able to achieve. The actresses who collectively made up the convent of nuns were also impressive, especially Charlotte Hope, who plays Sister Victoria. Despite her brief appearance, Hope makes quite an impression as a nun who is hopelessly out of her element and at the complete mercy of this demonic influence. She completely sells the sheer horror of her situation and her reluctance to do what she must. All the nuns manage to convey this terror to the main characters, and the centerpiece of the movie is probably the chapel scene when all of the nuns plus Taissa Farmiga desperately pray to keep Valak from possessing them and spreading its influence outside the abbey walls. If it seems like I'm gushing about the performances, it's because I am. The players here carry the film almost entirely on their shoulders, and everything would have crumbled immediately if not for their committed and nuanced acting performances. Many a horror film have been rescued by good acting and a strong emphasis on the atmosphere before. And while those two things do a lot of goodwill in masking the flaws in the film, they aren't enough for the film to completely overcome its flimsy script. One of the main issues I had with the film was its drastically uneven tone. There were a few slightly comedic moments in the beginning of the film when we're first meeting our characters and setting up their arcs for the rest of the movie that felt really natural and gave us some warmth and light for our characters to bask in before plunging headfirst into the horrors that awaited them. However, towards the end of the film, right as it was building towards the climax, the characters started spouting off one-liners and jokes, and it just came off as really jarring and out of place. Making it even worse was the fact that the previous scene had been the scariest and most interesting set piece in the entire film. The stakes were high, and everything seemed to be coming together for a really solid finale. I was feeling as if the film were about to be redeemed. Instead, the film ruined any goodwill it had earned with me, and I left the theater with a sour taste in my mouth. The jokes felt extremely forced, like they were lifted from a Marvel movie. I don't know if the film had any sort of reshoots after the principal photography wrapped, but these scenes felt like they were added in at the last minute. Sure, the character of Frenchie was obviously placed in the movie as a comic relief character, and to be there as a shoehorned-in reference to the other films, but more on that later. But as soon as the other characters, who until this point had been taking the movie and the demon seriously, started cracking jokes as well, it just ruined the whole rest of the movie for me. I couldn't take it seriously anymore because the characters didn't. What should have felt like a rousing finale with high stakes deflated into an almost afterthought. Also, as many other horror films in the past, the constant and heavily telegraphed jump scares became exhausting to sit through. The Conjuring series has made most of its money on good, old-fashioned jump scares, with a few exceptions. But here they lose their impact after being subjected to so many in such a short time. There were a few that genuinely shocked me and were well placed and had a good amount of build up to them. But any scenes that took place in a hallway, I knew as soon as the camera panned in one direction that a spooky figure or jump scare would be waiting for me when the camera panned back. It feels as cliche as those jump scares to be complaining about them in a horror movie, but it's just tiring and it's not scary anymore. We've seen these 100 times before and they're losing their impact. There are better ways to scare us in a horror movie than having something jump out at us every few seconds. That's not scary, it's us being startled. Being startled and being scared are not the same thing, and I really wish modern filmmakers making horror movies would realize that. In addition to the jump scares, like so many other horror films, The Nun also takes pleasure in changing the rules and introducing magical MacGuffins that will advance the plot whenever it's needed. Even though the aforementioned coffin scene with Demian Bichir was a nail-biting and intense sequence, nothing about it made any sort of sense. He falls into the coffin, and then we pan up to see that it's completely buried. The dirt didn't seem to be freshly laid or dug up, and I could see grass and plants covering the surface. While it did serve as an interesting payoff to the coffin bells that were set up earlier in the film, nothing about the scene made any logical sense. That kind of logic, or lack thereof, completely takes me out of the movie. The same goes with the blood on the front steps being magically wet and fresh, and the sphere with the blood of Christ, the latter of which was the punchline for another out-of-place joke. Look, I get that this is a movie about a demonic nun, and that a certain amount of suspension of disbelief is required to make sense of the plot. But the nun never sets up any sort of rulebook or guidelines on how this demon operates and what its powers are. The film just seems to make them up as it goes along, which left me scratching my head too many times, asking how any of this was even possible. You have to set up rules for your movie, and you have to follow them for everything to make sense. Otherwise, you're just left with this absurdly overpowered villain that gets stopped just because the movie says so. This victory doesn't feel earned because the characters have essentially entered cheat codes in order to achieve it. Also, as seen in The Conjuring 2, the only way to truly defeat Valak was to learn and say its true name, which Father Burke does midway through the film. However, this never comes into play, and Valak is defeated in a rather cliche and trite way, and not even totally. We know from the get-go that Valak will go on to terrorize the Warrens later on in the series, so maybe that's why they couldn't totally defeat it in this film. But they didn't even acknowledge Valak by name in the climax, and so it just feels like a weird choice to ignore this particular plot point. And when a movie continually takes me out of the moment with dumb logic like this, it just makes it that much harder each time to reinvest back into the movie and the characters. Which is a real shame because, as previously mentioned, the players here do an immense job of elevating this material. But good actors can only do so much with poor material to work with, and the rest falls to the producers, screenwriters, and director. And it's disheartening to see such talented actors give more effort and thought into a story and their characters than the screenwriter apparently did. The story in this movie is almost bare bones, with little in the way of natural emotions or drama to get behind. The introduction does a lot to set up our characters, especially our introduction to Farmiga's sister Irene, who is seen playing with a group of young girls in one of the few genuinely light-hearted moments that doesn't feel shoehorned in. These moments are extremely far and few in between though, and a lack of real emotion or scenes of the characters just talking to each other really keep them from truly connecting. In the reveal at the end of the movie that one of the main characters was connected to the Warrens, specifically the first Conjuring movie, just didn't click with me the way that Annabelle Creation had previously and effortlessly teased the nun. There was a nice little Easter egg to Annabelle Creation in the middle of the movie that I enjoyed, and had the ending been more subtle in connecting the nun to the larger cinematic universe, then it would have connected with me more. This was the first film in the series that I felt like it was trying too hard to connect to the other films, and that's the kind of filmmaking that I absolutely despise. I really hope that New Line and James Wan aren't getting too cocky with themselves, and dial back on the connections in future films, and bring focus back on telling good stories and making quality movies. I really wanted to love The Nun. I had high hopes for it, and Warner Brothers did a fantastic job of marketing and hyping this movie. Outside of Blumhouse, Warner Brothers has become my go-to for new horror, and they have thus far done an amazing job on delivering the goods. That hot streak is what makes The Nun that much more disappointing, and ultimately that's what I would classify this movie as, a major disappointment. The movie's not without its merits, and it is leagues above the first Annabelle in my opinion. It tries hard and succeeds most of the time in building an atmosphere of dread and foreboding, and several of the jump scares were well timed and quite effective. The acting and small nuances here and there really connected with me, and I would have to say that this is right up with the other films in terms of star power and performances. But the heavily telegraphed jump scares that didn't work, the wonky storytelling, and the willingness to break the rules one too many times, combined with the out-of-place jokes and inconsistent tone, really bring this movie down. The Nun is by no means a bad movie, it's just an aggressively mediocre one, and that's the film's cardinal sin. The Conjuring Universe has built a reputation and now an expectation of quality horror films, and so I expect better of this series than this. If you're a fan of the Conjuring Universe, then I would highly recommend it, if just for Taissa Farmiga and the ending connection to the first Conjuring film. Also, if you're easily scared and like jump scare filled horror films, then this is also the film for you. For everyone else though, I think you would find it hard to invest in the film if you're not a fan of this series, and I would wait until it comes out on streaming and home video. But who knows? With The Nun already making a killing at the box office, it's highly likely that we're going to be seeing a continuation of this story and character in the near future. Hopefully though, the filmmakers will learn from their mistakes here by taking a lesson from Annabelle creation for the next follow-up, and give us a film that is worthy of Valak's immense power and evil. As always guys, thank you for joining me today. Let's start the conversation down below. Tell me what your thoughts were of the movie. Do you agree with me? Do you think it's a really uneven mess of a film that had potential? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Let me know your opinions. I'm really eager and excited to hear what you guys thought. As always, you guys take care of yourselves, and I will be seeing you all again real soon.